The quiet after hours. The fluorescent lights, usually a harsh glare, softened in the quiet after hours, casting long, friendly shadows across the deserted cubicles. Oliver hummed a tuneless melody under his breath, a small, contented sound that blended with the gentle whir of the cooling servers in the back room. He savored these moments, the office shedding its daytime frenzy, transforming into a peaceful, almost contemplative space. He meticulously arranged the stack of proposals on his desk, aligning their edges with an almost surgical precision. His keyboard, worn smooth from countless keystrokes, received a quick wipe, its surface gleaming faintly. A half-empty mug, remnants of his afternoon tea, was carried to the small kitchenette, rinsed, and placed in the drying rack. Each small task was a ritual, a silent declaration of order in a world that often felt chaotic. Tonight, however, the familiar rhythm was disrupted. A shuffling sound, heavier than the usual creaks of an old building settling, drew his attention. Vincent Maxwell, his boss, usually a whirlwind of energy, moved with an uncharacteristic slowness through the corridor. His normally immaculate suit jacket was slightly askew, a faint wrinkle marring the crisp line of his trousers. The usually perfectly coiffed hair looked a little rumpled, as if he'd run a hand through it one too many times. He didn't carry the usual stack of folders, nor was his phone pressed to his ear. He just ambled, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the office walls, a distant hollow look in his eyes that Oliver hadn't seen before. Oliver paused his tidying, his hand hovering over a stray paperclip. He watched, unobtrusively, as Vincent reached his own office door, not striding in with his usual confident gait, but hesitating, his hand on the knob as if debating whether to enter at all. The hesitation was brief, a flicker, before he pushed the door open and disappeared inside, the soft click of the latch echoing in the sudden silence. Oliver resumed his work, but the quiet had shifted. It was no longer the peaceful, solitary hum he cherished. Now, it was tinged with an unfamiliar tension, a subtle hum of unspoken worry. He found himself listening, not for the server's whir, but for any sound from Vincent's office. A cough, a sigh, a muttered curse, anything to break the heavy silence that had settled. Nothing came. The rain had started just after 5, a soft, persistent drizzle that had now intensified into a steady drumming against the large panoramic windows. It was Tuesday, a day that usually saw Vincent booming with plans, deadlines, and a relentless energy that could be both inspiring and exhausting. Tonight, he was a different man. Oliver had just finished locking up the supply cabinet when Vincent reappeared. He didn't speak, didn't even meet Oliver's gaze. Instead, he walked past his own office, past the deserted marketing department, and stopped by Oliver's desk. Without a word, he sat down on its edge, the polished wood groaning softly under his weight. He didn't lean back, didn't cross his legs. He simply sat, his hands clasped loosely between his knees, his shoulders slumped ever so slightly. The rain outside intensified, a symphony of drumming against the glass, making the silence within the office even more profound. Oliver found himself acutely aware of the rhythmic drip of water from the awning outside, the faint scent of damp concrete wafting in through a slightly ajar vent. He could feel the weight of Vincent's presence, an unfamiliar vulnerability radiating from the man who was usually a fortress of composure. Oliver didn't know what to say. He was used to Vincent's boisterous pronouncements, his quick decisions, his confident directives. This Vincent, quiet and still, was a stranger. Oliver, ever the observer, noticed the tremor in Vincent's hands, the slight clench of his jaw. He wanted to offer comfort, a kind word, but he also sensed that any attempt to break the silence might shatter something fragile. cleared his throat, a soft, almost apologetic sound. Rough day, Vincent? The words felt clumsy, inadequate. Vincent finally lifted his head. His eyes, usually sharp and keen, were clouded with a weariness that went beyond mere fatigue. He looked at Oliver, really looked at him, and for a moment, Oliver felt a jolt of something akin to recognition, a glimpse into a depth he hadn't known existed beneath the polished surface. Vincent didn't answer Oliver's question directly. He just stared out the window, at the blurry lights of the city reflecting on the wet pavement. It's quiet tonight, isn't it? His voice was low, raspy, a stark contrast to his usual booming tone. It was less a question and more a statement, a broken observation. Oliver nodded slowly, watching the rain streak down the glass. It is. He waited, giving Vincent space, a silent invitation to speak, or not to. The air crackled with a new kind of energy, an unspoken understanding forming between them, forged in the quiet hum of the office and the steady drumming of the rain. The professional distance that had always existed, a clear line between boss and employee, felt less defined, blurred by the shared stillness, the raw vulnerability that Vincent, in his silence, had unknowingly exposed. Oliver felt a pull, a gentle but insistent tug towards this changed man, a nascent empathy blossoming in his chest. This wasn't just his boss anymore. This was a man hurting. And Oliver, in his quiet, unassuming way, felt an unexpected urge to offer solace. Cracks in the facade, the server rack's familiar hum, the office's nightly lullaby, usually comforted Oliver's precise nature. Tonight, however, it was swallowed by a different quiet, the heavy, almost suffocating silence emanating from Vincent. Oliver, ever the silent observer, continued to organize the last files on his desk, his movements economical and sharp. He stole glances at his boss, slumped in Oliver's chair, eyes fixed on the polished floor. Vincent's expensive suit jacket was rumpled, a stark departure from his usual impeccable presentation. She just didn't understand, Vincent mumbled, his words nearly lost in the ambient hum. He didn't meet Oliver's gaze, his stare still lost on some unseen point. Oliver paused, a file folder halfway into its drawer. He didn't respond immediately. A polite platitude sprang to mind, but something in Vincent's voice, a raw vulnerability he'd never encountered, held him back. Instead, he simply closed the drawer, its soft click echoing. He returned to his own chair, settling in a few feet from Vincent, offering only his quiet presence. Vincent shifted, a sigh escaping him that sounded less like exasperation and more like a deflating balloon. Sarah, everything was a negotiation. Even quiet nights. Always had to be doing something, going somewhere. A faint trace of bitterness underscored profound weariness. Said I was boring. Said I was stagnant. Oliver listened, his gaze steady on Vincent's profile. He had always known Vincent as the formidable, charismatic CEO, a man who commanded effortless attention and respect. To see him now, stripped of that polished veneer, was disorienting, like finding a fault line in an unyielding surface. He didn't speak, knowing instinctively that words wouldn't help. He simply held the space, a quiet anchor in the office's suddenly turbulent emotional landscape. The house, it was hers really, Vincent continued, his voice gaining a fraction of its usual resonance, though still tinged with exhaustion. Every cushion, every painting. My opinion was tolerated at best. Now it's just gone, as if it was never mine. He ran a hand over his face, scrubbing at his temples as if to erase a persistent headache. The faint shadow of stubble on his jaw usually meticulously shaved, spoke volumes of recent neglect. Oliver's mind, usually a hive of data and schedules, was surprisingly clear. A nascent warmth bloomed within him, a gentle pull of empathy for the man beside him. He saw not just his boss, but a person in genuine pain. He wondered what it must be like to have your meticulously built world suddenly crumble. He thought of his own quiet apartment, his curated collection of books and art, and a pang of understanding for Vincent's displacement resonated. She said. She needed more, Vincent whispered. More excitement, more passion, as if a decade of building a life together wasn't enough, as if I hadn't given her everything. He finally turned his head, his eyes, usually sharp and penetrating, now clouded with a raw, almost childlike hurt. He looked at Oliver, not as his employee, but as another human, a silent witness to his unraveling. Oliver met his gaze, his own blue eyes reflecting quiet compassion. He offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a non-verbal affirmation that he was listening, that he understood, even if he couldn't fully comprehend the depth of Vincent's pain. A quiet strength gathered within him, a readiness to bear witness, to simply be there for this man who, for the first time, seemed utterly, irrevocably human. The professional chasm between them had narrowed to a fragile, shared space. A new routine. The hushed hum of the office at midnight became their sanctuary. Fluorescent lights, usually harsh and unforgiving, softened to a muted glow, casting long shadows that danced with the occasional passing car outside. Vincent, once a bastion of impenetrable composure, now leaned back in his leather chair. The faint scent of stale coffee and something undeniably human. Grief, perhaps, clinging to him. His tie was perpetually loosened, a stark contrast to the perfectly knotted silk Oliver had grown accustomed to. Their conversations began with work, a necessary facade, before inevitably drifting. Tonight, Vincent spoke of Sarah's love for a specific kind of jasmine tea, a trivial detail that nonetheless carried the weight of 100 unspoken memories. She always said it reminded her of spring, he murmured, his gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the frosted glass of his office. Even in the dead of winter, Oliver, usually content to absorb, found himself nodding. My grandmother used to grow jasmine, he offered. The word surprising even himself. He rarely spoke of his personal life, a careful boundary he'd erected years ago. The scent would fill the house on warm evenings. Vincent's head turned, a flicker of genuine interest sparking in his tired eyes. Did it? I always imagined you as someone who preferred order, not the wildness of a garden. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, the first Oliver had seen in weeks. The evenings bled into weeks, each late-night exchange peeling back another layer. Vincent, emboldened by Oliver's quiet presence, began to reveal more than just memories of Sarah. He spoke of the crushing weight of responsibility, the loneliness of leadership, the constant pressure to be faultless. His voice, usually resonant and commanding, occasionally cracked with a vulnerability that tugged at something deep within Oliver. Oliver, in turn, found himself speaking with an ease he hadn't known he possessed. He recounted anecdotes from his childhood, shared his thoughts on obscure documentaries, even confessed a secret passion for restoring antique clocks. Each shared detail felt like an invisible thread, weaving a delicate tapestry between them. He noticed Vincent's posture subtly shift when he spoke, leaning forward, an unspoken invitation for more. One Tuesday, a particularly grueling day had left Vincent looking utterly depleted. He pushed a stack of reports aside. Oliver, he began, his voice raspy. I'm looking at these designs for the new marketing campaign. They're adequate. He paused, rubbing a hand across his jaw. But I can't shake the feeling they're missing something, a certain spark. He picked up a glossy printout of a sleek minimalist logo. What do you think? Honestly, not as my employee, but as someone who sees things differently. Oliver studied the logo, then the accompanying text. It was adequate, clean, professional, but sterile. He thought of the vibrant hues of his grandmother's jasmine, the intricate gears of a clock. It's efficient, Oliver said carefully, choosing his words. But it lacks warmth. It doesn't tell a story. It just presents a product. He glanced at Vincent, expecting a polite dismissal. Instead, Vincent leaned back, a thoughtful expression on his face. A story, he repeated, as if tasting the word. You're right. We've become so focused on data, on metrics, we've forgotten the narrative. He picked up a pen, twirling it idly. How would you tell this story, Oliver? The question hung in the air, weighty and unexpected. It wasn't about deadlines or budget reports. It was about perspective, about intuition. Oliver felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet affirmation. This wasn't just comfort. It was connection. It was a space where his thoughts, beyond the precise calculations of his daily tasks, were genuinely sought, genuinely valued. The tension in the room, usually a constant hum beneath the surface, began to dissipate, replaced by a nascent, unfamiliar sense of ease. The late-night talks were no longer just about Vincent's grief. They were about shared understanding, about two men navigating the quiet intimacy of their unexpected bond. The weight of loss. The late hour had become their unspoken cue, a silent agreement that the world outside the office walls could recede, leaving only the soft hum of the servers and the low murmur of their voices. Vincent, usually a fortress of tailored suits and sharp retorts, was a different man in these twilight hours. Tonight, his usually crisp shirt was untucked, the sleeves rolled haphazardly, and a 5 o'clock shadow dusted his jaw. He looked less like a CEO and more like a man adrift, anchored only by the worn leather of his office chair. Oliver watched him from across the polished expanse of the desk, the soft glow of his monitor illuminating his thoughtful expression. He had learned to read the subtle shifts in Vincent's posture, the minute changes in his gaze. Tonight, a deep weariness clung to Vincent like a shroud. I don't know, Oliver, Vincent finally said, his voice raspy, a stark contrast to his usual booming confidence. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, leaving it standing in bewildered tufts. Everything feels foreign, like I'm watching my own life from a distance, and I don't recognize the protagonist. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his gaze fixed on some invisible point beyond the window. Sarah, the divorce, it wasn't just a separation of assets. It was an unmooring. I feel completely lost. The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. Oliver felt a familiar ache in his chest, a deep empathy that resonated with Vincent's pain. He wanted to offer words, a solution, anything to alleviate the burden he saw crushing Vincent, but he knew that sometimes words were not enough. I built my entire life around an idea, I suppose, Vincent continued, his voice barely above a whisper. The successful businessman, the devoted husband, the perfect life. And now it's all shattered. I question every decision I've ever made. Was it all a performance? Was any of it real? He let out a humorless laugh, a sound devoid of mirth. Even this company. Sometimes I look at it, at all the intricate machinery we've built, and I wonder if I even know how to steer it anymore. Oliver pushed back his chair, the slight scrape of the legs against the floor, a quiet punctuation mark in the heavy silence. He walked around the desk, his movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to startle the fragile openness Vincent was displaying. The air in the office, usually charged with ambition and deadlines, had taken on a new texture, a fragile intimacy that felt both delicate and profound. The scent of stale coffee mingled with a faint, clean note of Oliver's cologne, a grounding presence in the swirling uncertainty. He stopped beside Vincent's chair, the man's shoulders hunched, his head bowed. Without a word, Oliver reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before gently settling on Vincent's shoulder. It was a small gesture, barely a touch, yet it felt monumental. The fabric of Vincent's shirt was soft beneath Oliver's palm, and he could feel the subtle tremor running through the broad frame. Vincent flinched slightly at the contact, a quick, almost imperceptible movement, then slowly relaxed into the touch. He didn't look up, but Oliver felt a subtle shift in his posture, a loosening of the tension that had held him so rigidly. It wasn't a comforting squeeze, not a pat of reassurance, but a quiet acknowledgement, a shared weight. It was a silent promise that he wasn't alone in this labyrinth of doubt. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer heavy with unspoken grief, but imbued with a nascent understanding, a quiet strength passing between them. The gentle pressure of Oliver's hand was an anchor in Vincent's storm, a small, firm point in a world that had suddenly become amorphous and terrifying. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, a muted symphony that underscored the profound quiet within their shared space. It was in this hush, under the weight of loss, that something new, unexpected, and deeply personal began to bloom. Unsettled gaze. The fluorescent hum of the office had always been a steady, almost comforting drone for Oliver, a backdrop to his meticulous work. But after that raw, late-night confession, the sound seemed to carry a new resonance, a subtle vibration in the air that echoed the tremor in his own chest. He found himself glancing up more often, his gaze drawn magnetically to Vincent's office. The glass wall now less a barrier and more a transparent pane through which a changed man was visible. Vincent, typically a whirlwind of focused energy, now moved with a deliberate, almost hesitant pace. His sharp suits, once impeccable, showed a slight rumple, and the usually slicked back hair had a tendency to fall across his forehead, giving him a softer, almost boyish look. It was the way he looked at Oliver, though, that truly unsettled him. Before, Vincent's gaze had been direct, assessing, always professional. Now, Oliver would catch him, sometimes in the middle of a complex spreadsheet, sometimes while retrieving a file from the printer, and find Vincent watching him. There was a new softness in those usually piercing blue eyes, a lingering quality that spoke not of tasks or deadlines, but of something deeper, something akin to contemplation, even tenderness. It wasn't overt, a fleeting moment that would vanish as soon as their eyes met, replaced by a quick, almost embarrassed dip of Vincent's head or a sudden turn to his computer screen. But it was there, a thread of unexpected warmth weaving through the cool professionalism of the office. One afternoon, Oliver was wrestling with a particularly stubborn pivot table when he felt it again, the prickle on the back of his neck that signaled Vincent's attention. He slowly raised his head, his fingers still poised over the keyboard. Vincent was leaning back in his chair, a half-empty coffee mug on his desk, his eyes fixed on Oliver. The expression was unreadable, yet undeniably gentle. A faint upturn at the corners of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but held the echo of one. It was a gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of Oliver's carefully constructed composure, seeing past the diligent employee to something more, something vulnerable. A strange, unfamiliar fluttering erupted in Oliver's chest, a sensation he couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was startling, a sudden warmth that spread through him like spilled tea. His breath hitched, and he quickly averted his gaze, his cheeks heating. He pretended to find something fascinating in the data on his screen, his heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He'd never felt anything like it before. This peculiar mix of shyness and a quiet, yearning curiosity. Later that day, Mr. Henderson, the firm's senior partner, a man whose presence usually felt like a perfectly pressed suit and the scent of expensive cologne, cleared his throat loudly near Vincent's office. Oliver, still feeling the lingering afterglow of Vincent's gaze, stiffened, instinctively straightening his posture. "Vincent," Mr. Henderson's voice was crisp, formal. "A moment of your time, if you please." Vincent, who had been staring out his window with a faraway look, turned, his usual composure reasserting itself with a visible effort. "Of course, Mr. Henderson." Mr. Henderson stepped into the office, his gaze sweeping over the slight disarray of Vincent's desk, then flickered towards Oliver's cubicle. "I couldn't help but notice," he began, his voice dropping slightly, though still perfectly audible to Oliver, "the rather late hours you've been keeping, and Oliver too, if I'm not mistaken." Oliver felt a blush creep up his neck. He bent his head further over his keyboard, feigning intense concentration. "The commitment is commendable, of course," Mr. Henderson continued, a pointed edge to his tone. "However, while dedication is valued, we must also ensure our employees are well rested and productive. These late nights can lead to burnout, and frankly, some rather uncharacteristic dishevelment." His gaze, Oliver felt, was now firmly on Vincent. "One must maintain appearances, Vincent, especially at your level. Perception is everything." Vincent's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Understood, Mr. Henderson. I assure you, my work is not suffering." "I have no doubt of your capabilities, Vincent," Mr. Henderson replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just be mindful. The office has a certain rhythm, a certain expectation of decorum. Let's not disrupt it, shall we?" Mr. Henderson offered a tight, polite smile, then pivoted and walked away, his footsteps echoing precisely down the corridor. Oliver risked a glance at Vincent. His boss was leaning back in his chair again, but this time his expression was not soft. It was etched with a familiar weariness, overlaid with a new flicker of defiance that Oliver had never seen before. He wondered if Mr. Henderson understood just how much Vincent's carefully constructed world had already been disrupted. And he wondered too what it meant for the strange, blossoming connection between himself and his boss. The flutter in his chest had quieted, replaced by a knot of concern, a quiet tension that now seemed to hum in the very air of the office. Sudden silence. The tender gazes that had been Oliver's constant private companion for weeks suddenly evaporated. Vincent, who had seemed to soften and unfold before Oliver's eyes, abruptly retreated behind a wall of professional decorum, so thick it felt impenetrable. The easy banter, the lingering presence in Oliver's office doorway, the shared late-night silences that had hummed with unspoken understanding, all vanished, replaced by a chilling formality. "Thorne," Vincent would say, the word clipped and devoid of its recent warmth. "Have you finished the Henderson brief? Or, I require the updated Q3 projections by end of day." His voice, once a soothing rumble that resonated with vulnerability, now held a sharp, businesslike edge. He avoided eye contact, his gaze sweeping over Oliver's head, or fixating on a point just beyond his shoulder. The warmth that had begun to bloom in Oliver's chest withered, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. It wasn't just the shift in tone, it was the physical distance. Vincent, who had taken to wandering into Oliver's office to simply exist in the same space, now only appeared for necessary directives, standing stiffly in the doorway, his posture rigid, the subtle dishevelment that had hinted at his weariness, the slightly rumpled shirt, the loosened tie, all gone. He was meticulously groomed again, his suits pressed, his hair perfectly in place, a polished mask that revealed nothing. The man who had confessed his deepest fears to Oliver in the quiet of the night, the man who had shared his vulnerability, seemed to have been erased. Oliver found himself glancing at the clock more often than usual. Vincent, who had made a habit of working well past sunset, now packed his briefcase with almost surgical precision at precisely 4:55 p.m. By 5 p.m. on the dot, for 3 consecutive days, Oliver heard the distinct click of Vincent's office door, followed by the measured footsteps receding down the hall. The office, once a sanctuary of shared solitude, now felt vast and empty the moment Vincent departed. The air, which had thrummed with the unspoken current between them, became still and lifeless. The sudden silence was deafening. Oliver missed the low hum of Vincent's voice from his office, the occasional tap on his door, even the shared exhaustion that had bound them together. He missed the way Vincent's eyes, even when shadowed by fatigue, had held a question, a plea, a silent acknowledgement of their burgeoning connection. Now, there was nothing but a void. He replayed their last intimate conversation in his mind, searching for a misstep, an unwitting word that might have caused this abrupt retreat. Had he said too much? Too little? Had his own burgeoning feelings, perhaps inadvertently revealed in a glance or a gesture, frightened Vincent away? The thought twisted in his gut. He remembered the faint blush on Vincent's cheeks when Oliver had offered him a fresh cup of coffee, the way their fingers had brushed, the almost imperceptible tremor in Vincent's hand. Had that proximity, that unexpected intimacy, been too much for Vincent to process? The ache in Oliver's chest deepened with each passing day of Vincent's withdrawal. It wasn't merely the loss of a confidant. It was the loss of a nascent connection, a tender shoot that had barely begun to unfurl before being brutally nipped in the bud. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a cold loneliness that seeped into his bones. The office, which had once felt like a haven from the outside world, now amplified his solitude. He found himself staring blankly at his monitor, the reports blurring before his eyes, his mind consumed by the relentless question, what went wrong? He tried to distract himself with work, burying himself in spreadsheets and proposals, but the emptiness persisted. He missed the quiet camaraderie, the shared glances across the desk, the feeling of being truly seen. He missed the man who had, in his vulnerability, inadvertently cracked open something in Oliver's own guarded heart. The unexpected tenderness that had blossomed between them had been a fragile thing. And now it lay shattered, leaving Oliver to pick up the pieces in the sudden, echoing silence. He felt adrift, navigating an emotional landscape he hadn't known existed, now left to wander it alone. The looming deadline. The fluorescent lights hummed a dreary tune over their heads, casting a sickly yellow glow on the scattered documents and half-empty coffee cups. Outside, the city had long since receded into a shimmering tapestry of streetlights and distant traffic. But inside the sprawling office, the clock ticked with unforgiving urgency. A major presentation, a cornerstone of the company's next quarter, loomed less than 12 hours away, demanding their undivided attention. Oliver, hunched over a laptop, felt the familiar ache settling into his shoulders. He adjusted his glasses, scanning a spreadsheet for a misplaced decimal. The quiet hum of the air conditioning was punctuated only by the rhythmic click of his keyboard and the occasional rustle of papers from Vincent's desk across the room. The unspoken words between them felt like a physical barrier, thick and impenetrable, pressing down on the air, making it difficult to breathe. The easy intimacy they had once shared, the comfortable silence punctuated by shared jokes or a knowing glance, was now a gaping void. Vincent, usually impeccably dressed even at this late hour, looked like a man wrestling with a storm. His tie was loosened, his shirt slightly rumpled, and dark circles smudged beneath his eyes. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, a gesture Oliver had come to associate with deep weariness. Vincent's usual crisp, authoritative demeanor was frayed at the edges, replaced by a quiet intensity that bordered on desperation. He tapped a pen against his teeth, his gaze fixed on a complex graph, but Oliver could sense the distraction, the constant battle within him. The Q3 projections for the European market. Are you certain about these figures, Oliver? Vincent's voice, though low, cut through the silence with an unexpected sharpness. Oliver flinched, surprised by the abruptness. Yes, Vincent. I cross-referenced them with the regional sales data twice. The growth projection is conservative, but realistic, given the current economic climate. He pushed his glasses further up his nose, feeling a familiar nervousness coil in his stomach. Vincent picked up a printed sheet, his brow furrowed. But this 2% dip here, he jabbed a finger at a small dip in the graph. It seems disproportionate. Are you absolutely certain this isn't an anomaly, perhaps a data entry error? His tone was laced with an edge Oliver hadn't heard in weeks, a return to the purely professional, almost dismissive manner that had characterized their initial interactions. Oliver felt a prickle of irritation, quickly suppressed. He'd spent hours on those projections, meticulously verifying every number. It's not an error, Vincent. That dip accounts for the anticipated impact of the new regulatory changes in Germany. We discussed it in the preliminary meeting last week. Vincent slammed the paper down on his desk, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet office. We discussed a potential impact, Oliver, not a guaranteed 2% drop. This could undermine the entire proposal. His voice had risen, betraying a frustration that went beyond the numbers. A beat of stunned silence followed. Oliver stared, his heart thumping against his ribs. He had never heard Vincent speak to him with such undisguised anger, not even in the early days when their dynamic was strictly boss-employee. The familiar flush of heat rose to Oliver's cheeks. He felt a sharp sting, a sudden acute ache that resonated deeper than professional slight. Then, just as quickly as it had erupted, the anger drained from Vincent's face, leaving it pale and etched with something akin to self-reproach. He closed his eyes for a moment, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. Oliver, I'm so sorry. His voice was barely a whisper, raw and laced with exhaustion. He picked up the offending sheet, smoothing the crumpled edge with a shaky hand. You're right. We did discuss it. My memory. It's been failing me lately. He looked up, his eyes meeting Oliver's, and in their depths, Oliver saw a profound weariness, a vulnerability that was startling in its intensity. I'm out of line. Please forgive me. The apology hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning, a fragile bridge over the chasm that had opened between them. Oliver's irritation dissolved, replaced by a familiar pang of concern. The sharp edges of their professional relationship softened, if only for a fleeting moment, allowing a glimpse of the man who had confided in him, the man who had inadvertently peeled back layers of his own carefully constructed emotional walls. The silence that followed was different this time. No longer a wall, but a shared moment of awkward understanding, a fragile thread woven between them by the exigencies of their work and the lingering ghosts of their past intimacy. A whisper of confusion. The silence in Vincent's office after his raw apology stretched thin and brittle, taut as a violin string about to snap. The lingering scent of stale coffee and faint ozone from the humming server in the corner seemed to amplify the quiet, pressing down on them both. Oliver, still reeling from the unexpected intensity of Vincent's words, found his gaze drawn to the man across the desk. Vincent, usually a fortress of controlled charisma, was crumbling. His shoulders were slumped, his tie askew, and the deep lines etched around his eyes spoke of battles fought in the small hours of the morning. Vincent traced the rim of his cooling coffee mug with a distracted finger, his eyes fixed on the condensation blooming on the ceramic. He wouldn't meet Oliver's gaze, not fully. When he finally spoke, his voice was a mere husk, barely a whisper against the hum of the air conditioning. I'm struggling, Oliver, he confessed, the words brittle, as if each one was a tiny shard he was forcing out. His hand trembled slightly as he set the mug down with a soft clink. With things I don't understand. The confession hung in the air, heavy and fragile. Oliver's heart gave a sympathetic lurch. He could feel the turmoil radiating off Vincent, a palpable cloud of confusion and pain. It wasn't the usual stress of a CEO facing quarterly projections. This was deeper, more personal, threatening to engulf the man whole. Oliver remembered the tenderness, the quiet intimacy that had blossomed between them after Vincent's wife left, an intimacy that had been so abruptly, inexplicably severed. He wondered if this was connected, if the things Vincent didn't understand were tied to that fractured connection. Oliver leaned forward slightly, his own voice soft, infused with a gentle concern that he hoped would offer some comfort. What kind of things, Vincent? He asked, the question hanging open, an invitation rather than a demand. He didn't push, didn't pry, merely offered a space for Vincent to unburden himself if he chose to. Vincent finally lifted his eyes, though they still didn't quite connect with Oliver's. They skittered past, settling instead on a point somewhere over Oliver's left shoulder. His jaw worked, a muscle twitching beneath his skin. Feelings, he mumbled, the word almost lost in the sudden clatter of a cleaning cart passing in the hallway outside. Confusing, unsettling feelings. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, leaving it even more rumpled. Oliver felt a pang of recognition. He too had been grappling with a confusing tangle of emotions since Vincent's sudden withdrawal. The hurt, the longing, the bewildering sense of rejection. It had all been a constant quiet hum beneath the surface of his professional composure. To hear Vincent admit to similar internal chaos, even if vaguely, was both a relief and a fresh wave of apprehension. Is it about the divorce? Oliver ventured, treading carefully, his voice barely above a murmur. He knew it was a loaded question, but it was the most obvious external catalyst for Vincent's current state. Vincent shook his head slowly, a barely perceptible movement. No, not just that. He paused, searching for words, his brow furrowed in concentration. It's internal, a disconnect, almost, between what I thought I knew and what I'm experiencing. He picked up a pen from his desk, twirling it absently between his fingers. his gaze still avoiding Oliver's direct stare. It's like trying to navigate a map that's suddenly changed, and I don't recognize any of the landmarks. Oliver listened intently, his quiet nature making him a natural receptacle for such veiled confessions. He sensed a profound vulnerability in Vincent that went beyond the immediate stress of their looming presentation. It was a vulnerability that hinted at a deeper crisis of identity, of self. The man who had always been so sure, so in control, was adrift. Sometimes, Oliver said, his voice a soft balm, when the map changes, it just means you're on a new path, and it's okay not to know where it leads at first. He kept his tone gentle, empathetic, hoping to convey his unwavering support without adding any pressure. He wanted Vincent to feel safe enough to speak more freely, to unravel the tangled thread of his emotions. Vincent finally met Oliver's eyes, a flicker of something unreadable, gratitude, desperation, passing through their depths. He didn't say anything more, but the brief eye contact, the slight softening of his rigid posture, was a small crack in the dam, a hint that Oliver's quiet understanding had registered, and perhaps offered a sliver of solace. The confusion in Vincent's gaze remained, but for a moment, it felt a little less solitary. Unveiling the heart. The quiet that descended after Vincent's admission was thick, broken only by the low thrum of the building's ventilation. Still reeling from the raw honesty in Vincent's tone, Oliver offered a silent nod, an unspoken invitation to continue. He watched as Vincent raked a hand through his already untidy hair, a telling gesture of his internal strife. The executive, typically so composed and impenetrable, now appeared utterly adrift. It's more than just the divorce, Vincent began, his voice a near whisper, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond Oliver's shoulder. That's a mess, of course, but beneath it all, there's something new, something I don't recognize. He paused, searching for the precise phrasing, his brow furrowed in deep thought. I just can't grasp it. These emotions, they're entirely unexpected, beyond anything I thought myself capable of. Oliver remained motionless, his own heart quickening with a blend of apprehension and a peculiar, quiet anticipation. He sensed the precipice Vincent teetered upon, the verge of a revelation that could either shatter or reinforce the delicate connection between them. Finally, Vincent met Oliver's eyes, and in their depths, Oliver saw a vulnerability that stole his breath. You, Vincent uttered, the word a soft exhalation. You genuinely see me, Oliver, truly see me. It's unsettling and terrifying. A humorless chuckle escaped him. My entire life has been dedicated to constructing this image, this persona, and you just dismantle it effortlessly. A faint flush crept up Oliver's neck. He yearned to speak, to offer solace. But he understood this moment wasn't primarily about him. It was Vincent's journey, his unraveling. With you, Vincent pressed on, his voice gaining a touch more strength. It's as if the incessant chatter in my mind goes quiet. All the expectations, the demands, the relentless pressure to perform, it all dissipates. I can simply exist, and you don't judge it. You just listen. His gaze held Oliver's, intense and probing. That's something I've never experienced before. Oliver's heart gave a painful lurch. He recalled their clandestine moments, the late-night discussions, the subtle understanding that had bloomed between them like a fragile, unforeseen blossom. He remembered the solace he'd found in Vincent's presence, how his own anxieties seemed to melt away when Vincent confided in him. Even with Sarah, Vincent stated, the name a bitter taste in the air. It was never like this. We had a shared life, a partnership. We built an empire in a sense. But there was always a distance, a performance, even in our most intimate moments. He slowly shook his head, a profound weariness settling upon his features. She saw the CEO, the husband, the provider. She saw what she anticipated, what she desired, but she never saw me. Oliver felt a pang of empathy for Sarah, despite a sudden surge of something akin to jealousy. He understood the pain of being overlooked, of having one's authentic self disregarded. Yet, Vincent's revelation was like a key turning in a lock, unlocking a deeper comprehension of the man before him. With you? Vincent reiterated, his voice now softer, almost reverent. It's different. You look at me, and I feel exposed, but not in a negative way. It's as though you see past every layer, every defense. You see the confusion, the fear, the profound loneliness. He finally looked away, a muscle twitching in his jaw. And you don't recoil. The air in the office crackled with unspoken emotions. Oliver felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to offer a comforting touch. But he held back, sensing that Vincent needed to navigate this confession on his own terms. He simply listened, his quiet presence a steadfast anchor in Vincent's turbulent sea. The intimacy of the moment was profound, a shared breath suspended between them, connecting them in a way that transcended their professional roles. It was a fragile, terrifying, beautiful unveiling. Deeper conversations. The city outside the panoramic windows had settled into a hush, the vibrant arteries of traffic now just a faint glow in the distance. Inside Vincent's office, a similar quiet had fallen, though it was punctuated by the low thrum of the building's HVAC system and the occasional rustle of papers as Vincent shifted in his chair. The late-night talks had indeed resumed, but the landscape of their conversations had irrevocably altered. The brittle veneer of professional distance had shattered, replaced by something raw and intimate. It's disorienting, Vincent confessed, his voice rough around the edges, a stark contrast to his usual polished tones. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, leaving it even more in disarray. He looked less like the formidable CEO and more like a man adrift, navigating uncharted emotional waters. This feeling is like discovering a new room in a house you thought you knew intimately, only to find it's not a room at all, but an entire wing you never suspected existed. Oliver, perched on the edge of the ergonomic chair opposite Vincent's desk, simply listened. His gaze, usually focused on the meticulous details of spreadsheets, was now soft, attentive, and utterly absorbed in Vincent. He offered no immediate advice, no platitudes. His presence alone was a steadying anchor in the turbulent sea of Vincent's introspection. The office, once a symbol of Vincent's control and power, had transformed into a sanctuary, a confessional booth under the silent judgment of the distant stars. I always thought I knew myself, Vincent continued, a weary sigh escaping him. My ambitions, my desires, my boundaries. Sarah, she fit into that framework. Or I made her fit. I tailored my expectations, my affections, to what I believed was acceptable, sustainable, what I believed I was capable of feeling. He paused. His eyes, usually sharp and discerning, now held a bewildered, almost lost quality. But with you, it's different. It's unsettling. Oliver's heart gave a quiet lurch. He understood the unspoken weight of Vincent's words, the careful articulation of a burgeoning truth that threatened to upend everything Vincent had built. He remained silent, allowing the space for Vincent's thoughts to unfurl without interruption. The air between them, thick with unspoken emotions, vibrated with a fragile energy. I find myself caring, Vincent admitted, the word tasting foreign on his tongue, as if he were trying it out for the first time. Not in the way I care for an employee, or even a friend. It's deeper, more insistent. And it scares me, Oliver. It truly scares me. He finally met Oliver's gaze, a raw vulnerability shining in his eyes that made Oliver's breath catch. I'm not sure what to do with it, or with this. His hand gestured vaguely between them, encompassing the shared space, the shared confessions, the unspoken understanding. Oliver, though shy by nature, felt a surge of quiet strength. He leaned forward slightly, his voice a low, calming murmur that cut through Vincent's agitation. You don't have to do anything with it right now, Vincent. You just have to feel it, acknowledge it. He chose his words carefully, each one weighted with empathy. It's okay to be unsettled. It's okay to feel things you didn't expect. Vincent looked at him then, a flicker of something akin to relief passing over his features. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, Oliver clarified gently, but it doesn't have to be a crisis either. It's just new, and new things can be intimidating, but they can also be good. He offered a small, reassuring smile, a quiet beacon in Vincent's storm. He wanted to reach out, to offer a comforting touch, but he held back, respecting the delicate boundaries that still existed, however blurred they had become. The CEO, usually so guarded, so impenetrable, seemed to visibly deflate. A tension he hadn't realized he was holding finally releasing. Good, he repeated, testing the word. I haven't felt good in a very long time, Oliver. Not genuinely good. Not in a way that feels right. He leaned back, his eyes fixed on Oliver. This feels right, and that's the most terrifying part of all. The admission hung in the air, a delicate, potent declaration. Oliver felt a profound tenderness bloom in his chest. He saw not just his boss, but a man stripped bare of pretense, grappling with a profound emotional awakening. And in that moment, under the silent gaze of the city, Oliver knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within him, that he would be there to help Vincent navigate whatever lay ahead. He would be Vincent's unwavering support, his quiet confidant, as Vincent slowly, tentatively, began to understand the new geography of his own heart. Small gestures. The days that followed were painted with a new, delicate palette. Vincent, still the formidable CEO in boardrooms, shed that armor the moment he stepped back into their shared office space. The edge in his voice softened. His shoulders, once perpetually hunched with the weight of his empire, seemed to relax subtly. Oliver noticed it first in the quiet way Vincent started bringing him tea. Not just any tea, but the specific Earl Grey with a splash of milk and one sugar, just as Oliver preferred. A detail Vincent had apparently filed away from some earlier, almost forgotten conversation. One Tuesday morning, Vincent appeared at Oliver's desk, not with a file or a directive, but with a steaming mug in each hand. The ceramic felt warm against Oliver's fingers as he accepted his. Thought you might need this, Vincent murmured, his gaze holding Oliver's for a beat longer than usual. The simple act, utterly devoid of professional pretense, sent a quiet warmth spreading through Oliver's chest, mirroring the heat of the mug. Vincent began to linger. Conversations that once concluded with a decisive nod and a pivot back to his own desk, now stretched, punctuated by unspoken thoughts and comfortable silences. He'd stand by Oliver's desk, ostensibly discussing a report, but his eyes would drift, catching Oliver's, a flicker of something raw and exposed passing between them. Sometimes he'd lean against the doorframe of Oliver's office, watching him work, a small, unreadable smile playing on his lips. Oliver found himself anticipating these moments, a subtle pulse quickening whenever Vincent's shadow fell across his periphery. This quiet affection, like a gentle tide, emboldened Oliver. He'd always been reserved, his emotions carefully contained, but Vincent's vulnerability had created a space for Oliver to unfurl. He started small, just as Vincent had. A hand resting for a second too long on Vincent's arm when passing a document. A gentle pat on the shoulder after a particularly draining meeting. A silent acknowledgement of the pressure Vincent carried. One evening, as they were the last two in the office, a late-night email arriving from a stubborn client. Vincent groaned, rubbing his temples. "This is going to be a long one," he sighed, his voice laced with exhaustion. Without a second thought, Oliver walked over to Vincent's chair. He reached out, his fingers gently finding the tense knot in Vincent's neck, beginning to massage. Vincent stiffened for a moment, a surprised intake of breath, then slowly relaxed, leaning into the touch. The scent of his cologne, a subtle blend of sandalwood and citrus, filled Oliver's senses. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft hum of the computers and the gentle kneading of Oliver's fingers. Vincent closed his eyes, a profound weariness etched on his face, yet a faint, contented hum vibrated in his throat. When Oliver finally withdrew his hands, Vincent opened his eyes, a soft, almost dazed expression on his face. He turned, looking up at Oliver, a question in his gaze that Oliver couldn't quite decipher, but understood nonetheless. It was a question of acceptance, of reciprocation, of permission. Oliver simply offered a small, reassuring smile, a silent promise. The next day, Vincent brought Oliver a small, potted succulent for his desk. "For luck?" he said, his voice a little gruffer than usual, as if embarrassed by the gesture. Oliver's heart swelled. He placed it carefully on his windowsill, a green testament to the burgeoning, unspoken connection between them. The tension in the office, once purely professional, had evolved. It was now a delicate, almost palpable current, shimmering between their desks, in the shared glances, the lingering touches, the quiet understanding that permeated their every interaction. It was a tension born not of conflict, but of anticipation, of unspoken desires slowly surfacing, of two souls tentatively reaching for something profound and unknown. Each small gesture, each prolonged look, was a brushstroke on a canvas, slowly revealing a masterpiece of connection neither of them had anticipated nor could now deny. Vincent, once so guarded, was allowing fragments of himself to show, fragments that Oliver carefully gathered and cherished. And in turn, Oliver, once so hidden, was blooming under the warmth of Vincent's quiet attention, his own affection a gentle, steady light. The CEO and his assistant were slowly, irrevocably transforming into something far deeper, far more complex. The office, once merely a place of work, had become the crucible of their awakening, the stormy confession. The sky had been bruised purple all day, a heavy promise of the storm that finally broke just as the city lights began to prickle through the gloom. Rain lashed against the towering windows of Vincent's office, each gust a percussive slap that made the glass flex. Thunder rumbled, a deep-seated growl that vibrated through the very foundations of the building. Oliver, having finished tidying his own desk, had paused at the threshold of Vincent's inner sanctum, intending to bid him good night. But Vincent hadn't stirred from his leather armchair, the one usually reserved for stern negotiations, now a silent cocoon. Vincent looked unusually quiet, his tie loosened and askew, a stark contrast to his usual pristine presentation. His hair, usually impeccably styled, was a little disheveled, falling over his brow in a way that made him appear younger, more exposed. The faint glow from his laptop screen painted his face in cool blues, highlighting the deep weariness etched around his eyes. He wasn't working, Oliver noticed. He was just staring, unseeing, at the digital clock ticking in the corner of his display. "Vincent?" Oliver's voice was soft, barely audible above the rising wind. Vincent started, as if woken from a trance, his gaze snapping towards Oliver. For a moment, his eyes, usually sharp and penetrating, seemed lost, almost pleading. He gestured vaguely to the empty chair opposite him. "Oliver, stay a moment, please." Oliver nodded, settling into the chair, the plush leather a familiar comfort. The storm outside intensified, rattling the panes, providing a dramatic backdrop to the quiet intimacy that now settled between them. The air was charged, not just with electricity from the tempest, but with an unspoken tension that had been building for weeks. Vincent leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his shoulders hunched. Do you ever feel completely untethered, Oliver?" His voice was rough, unvarnished, like you're floating in an empty space with nothing to hold on to. Oliver considered this, watching the rain streak down the glass, blurring the vibrant city lights into shimmering streaks. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper, "but I usually find something to ground myself. A task, a book, a purpose." "A purpose?" Vincent repeated, a dry, humorless chuckle escaping him. "I built an empire, Oliver. I thought that was my purpose. But lately, it feels hollow, like a grand monument built on quicksand." He paused, his gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the window. "The silence in my apartment after everything. It's deafening. It's a constant reminder of how utterly alone I am." Oliver felt a pang in his chest. He understood that kind of loneliness, the kind that gnawed at the edges of your soul. He'd lived with it for years, a quiet companion. But to hear Vincent, the formidable Vincent Maxwell, articulate it with such raw vulnerability was disarming. "Loneliness is a peculiar thing," Oliver offered gently. "It can consume you, or it can teach you about what you truly need." Vincent turned his head then, his eyes, usually so guarded, now open and searching. The blue light from the screen caught a shimmer of unshed tears. He studied Oliver's face, tracing the contours with a gaze that felt almost physical, a touch without contact. The air thickened, charged with a potent, undeniable current. "What I truly need," Vincent murmured, his voice barely audible above the howling wind and the drumming rain. He held Oliver's gaze, and in his eyes, Oliver saw a maelstrom of emotions. Fear, longing, a desperate hope. Then, Vincent took a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping slightly as if shedding an invisible burden. "Oliver," he said, his voice clearer now, though still laced with a profound vulnerability. I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air, suspended between them, stark and absolute against the backdrop of the raging storm. The thunder cracked again, closer this time, and the office lights flickered, plunging them into deeper shadows for a heart-stopping moment before blazing back to life. Oliver felt his own breath catch in his throat, a tremor running through him. The world outside raged, but in the quiet space of Vincent's office, time itself seemed to stop. A new chapter, The confession, raw and unbidden, hung in the charged air between them, a fragile bird caught in the storm's fierce grip. Vincent, usually so meticulously composed, was a disheveled wreck, his hair falling across his forehead, his shirt collar askew. His eyes, though, held Oliver's in an unwavering, almost desperate plea. It was a plea for understanding, for acceptance, perhaps even for a shared precipice to stand upon. The words, "I think I'm in love with you, Oliver," resonated with a terrifying vulnerability, stripping away the CEO, the powerful figure, and leaving only a man teetering on the edge. Oliver felt a tremor run through him, a seismic shift in his carefully constructed world. He saw the fear in Vincent's gaze, a stark mirror to his own burgeoning hope. For so long, he had navigated the intricate currents of Vincent's emotional landscape from a respectful distance, a quiet observer of his boss's unraveling. He had offered solace, a steady presence, a listening ear, never daring to imagine the depths of feeling that might lie beneath Vincent's guarded exterior, or the even more profound depths that had taken root within himself. Now, those depths had burst forth, a torrent that threatened to reshape everything. The office, usually a bastion of controlled calm, felt electric, thrumming with the unspoken weight of Vincent's admission. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, mimicking the tumultuous feeling swirling within Oliver. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm against the backdrop of the storm. He knew, instinctively, that this was a moment of no return, a crossroads that would define their future, whatever it might be. He didn't speak. Words at this juncture felt entirely inadequate. Instead, Oliver simply met Vincent's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them, a fragile bridge built over the chasm of their previous relationship. In Vincent's eyes, Oliver saw not just fear, but a flicker of something else, a desperate yearning, a nascent trust. And in Oliver's own response, a soft, unwavering gaze, Vincent must have read a mirroring of that trust, a quiet affirmation that he wasn't alone in this terrifying, exhilarating space. The silence stretched, not awkward, but pregnant with possibility, with the sheer magnitude of what had just been said and understood. The air crackled with an intensity that made Oliver's skin tingle. He could feel the warmth radiating from Vincent, even across the small distance separating them. A warmth that promised comfort and perhaps a new kind of belonging. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Vincent's rigid posture softened. The tension in his shoulders seemed to ease, a subtle release of the immense pressure he had been under. He took a shallow breath, his gaze still locked with Oliver's, a silent question passing between them. Now what? Oliver's answer wasn't verbal. It was in the gentle shift of his weight, the almost imperceptible inclination of his head, a silent invitation to move forward. He didn't offer platitudes or reassurances. He offered something far more profound. His presence, unwavering and true. It was a commitment, unspoken but undeniably felt, to navigate this new, uncharted territory together. The storm outside began to recede, its fury slowly giving way to a quieter, persistent rain. The wind's shriek diminished to a mournful sigh, and the frantic drumming against the windows softened to a steady patter. In the newfound quiet, broken only by the persistent hum of the office's dormant systems, a different kind of sound emerged. The soft, almost inaudible click of a new chapter beginning. The stark light from the computer screens cast long, distorted shadows across the room, but in the center, bathed in the dim glow, Vincent and Oliver remained, their gazes still intertwined. The air no longer felt heavy with unspoken desires, but light with the potential of shared ones. The corporate veneer had shattered, revealing the raw, beating heart beneath. Oliver felt a surge of emotions. Fear, yes, but also an overwhelming sense of profound rightness, a feeling that had been building within him, silently, for months. He had always been drawn to Vincent's intellect, his drive, his quiet intensity. But it was in these moments of vulnerability, these raw glimpses into the man behind the CEO, that Oliver had truly found himself captivated. And now, that captivity had transformed into something far deeper, far more resonant. Vincent's lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, a small, almost imperceptible tremor ran through his body. It wasn't a tremor of fear, but of profound release, of a dam finally breaking. His eyes, still holding Oliver's, seemed to shimmer with unshed emotion. The quiet hum of the office, once a symbol of their professional distance, now felt like the low thrum of a shared pulse, a quiet beginning to a story that was only just starting to unfold. The storm outside had cleared, but within the walls of Vincent's office, a new exhilarating tempest had just begun.